The other day, I was down at Edgewater Beach looking over this great lake of ours, Erie, and it got me thinking about our geography and how excited I was to move to Ohio, another state that borders Canada, and about paying respects to Black History Month. Now, you know that I'm a bit of a history buff. As I considered what I might talk about today, this transrelational relationship between Canada and the United States was, of course, central on my mind, looking as I was across the water. And that was all prompted by our place on the map. Ohio and Ontario are neighbors, and we have more in common than just Lake Erie. It was the shared history of people all around the shores of Lake Erie that brought me to the topic of the Underground Railroad. We have a wonderful shared history of people inspired by their faith and a desire for freedom, a shared story in the Underground Railroad. Now, when I first came here, I stopped and saw several of the places, being the history person that I am. But now it seems to be a good time to talk about it because most students in the United States learn at least a little something about the railroad. We learn that Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave who helped hundreds of others escape to freedom. We learn about the Fugitive Slave Act and the need for freed slaves to go north. We know they often went to Ohio, to my home state, Michigan, and then on to Canada. And that's kind of where our knowledge about things ends, at the border, at the water. The thing is, history is often like this. We learn the part of the story that is most germane to us, and the rest just sort of fades away. But of course, people came to the shores of Ontario and set up lives for themselves. Harriet Tubman herself had a home in St. Catharines, Ontario, in the 1850s. On a trip as volunteers with some senior citizens out of Port Huron, Michigan, my mom and dad visited the Tubman house in St. Catharines. And when I told my mom about this morning's sermon, she recalled her trip very fondly and remembered being very impressed with the site when they went for a visit. Of course, the story doesn't go just one way. No, it's not like the story of people fleeing slavery and then landing north in the slave shore of Ontario just stopped there. One of the greatest tools of the American efforts at abolition of slavery was inspired by a man living in Dresden, Ontario, a man named Josiah Henson. Mr. Henson met a Unitarian woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe met Mr. Henson, in Andover, Massachusetts, in her home. Inspired by both Mr. Henson's story and the way her own Unitarian faith called her to work for the abolition of slavery, Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. When her book was released, Mr. Henson wrote this about the book. When this novel of Mrs. Stowe came out, it shook the foundations of this world. It shook the Americans out of their shoes and out of their shirts. It left some of them on the sandbar, barefooted and scratching their heads. So they came to the conclusion that the whole thing was a fabrication. Mr. Henson met with Mrs. Stowe on one of his trips back to the United States in the service of abolition and of freeing individual people from the evils of slavery. Mr. Henson made dangerous returns to the States, guiding 118 others to freedom in his life. Mr. Henson, with the aid of Samuel Atkins Elliott, penned his own autobiography, The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself. It was published in 1849, 2 years before Uncle Tom's Cabin. Samuel Atkins Elliott would be, in his lifetime, both the mayor of the city of Boston, and at one point he became a representative for Massachusetts in Washington. He came from a prominent family, and his grandson, the Reverend Samuel Elliott, served the American Unitarian Association from 1898 to 1927 as its president. Now, not all the Unitarians in this story were on the leading or proper edge of history in this question of slavery in the United States. I'm quite sorry to report that President Millard Fillmore, in what could be called a flawed attempt to preserve the Union of the United States, signed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which allowed bounty hunters to pursue escaped people up north, up into the free states, and to be returned to the slave states. The bounty hunters, as you might imagine, and not so surprisingly, were often more interested in profit than ethics. And there are many tales of free blacks being erroneously returned to slavery. Solomon Northrum's book, 12 Years a Slave from 1853, made into a movie in 2013, is just one example of this appalling reality. There are, of course, many other stories that never got told. And since we're in Ohio, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention John Brown. John Brown, of course, was an abolitionist, sent, he felt, quote, by God to strike down the unholy institution of slavery, end quote. While Brown was not born in Ohio, but Connecticut, he grew up in the little town of Hudson. Recently, Denny and I visited Hudson a couple weeks ago because it's so close to where we live. There we discovered an historical plaque, and I can't pass those up, where it pointed out where it was in Hudson at the Congregational Church that Brown made his public declaration about his war on slavery during a meeting. John's father, Owen Brown, was a leading figure in Hudson and operated a station on the Underground Railroad himself. John Brown's attack at Harper's Ferry is often cited as one of the catalysts for the secession of the southern states and thereby the creation of two Americas, the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. In essence, for a time, those traveling along the Underground Railroad had to pass through three sovereign nations to get to freedom. This morning, I requested that Karin play the song Follow the Drinking Gourd because it's just one example of songs that were used to guide people along the Underground Railroad to freedom. According to some scholars, the song contains directions for escape from the deep south up to at least Ohio and probably into Canada. Here are some of the lyrics. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. The old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. The old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. Now, sometimes the old man is the river, of course. Now, the river bank makes a mighty good road, and the dead trees will show you the way. Left foot, peg foot, traveling on, follow the drinking gourd. Now the river ends between two hills. Follow the drinking gourd. There's another river on the other side. So follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. The old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. Without diving too deeply into the lyrics of the song or exegeting them ad nauseum, I'll say this: the song teaches those who know it when the best time to leave the plantation is. When the first quail calls is in the springtime. The riverbank refers to the Tombigbee River, which leads from northern Mississippi. Markings left on dead trees by a man named Peg Leg Joe helped you find your way, and the river ending in between two hills are directions to our very own Ohio River. Once over the river, an escaping slave was, until the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, safe. Along the way, you would follow the drinking gourd, which is another name for the Big Dipper, which points you north to freedom, to Canada, which in a way returns me back to Upper Canada, or as it's called today, Ontario. In Ontario, several communities of former slaves thrived. Places like Amherstburg, Chatham, London, Oro, Woolwich, and Windsor. Others crossed the Great Lakes to freedom and made their homes near Owen Sound and in Toronto. In each of these stories, some more famous than others, the people involved in the Underground Railroad, people's understanding of God called them to duty. Some of the histories have only captured a snippet of a whole life. Earlier Peg read just 3 entries of people that were helped along the Underground Railroad by Mr. William Still. Mr. Still was determined to tell the stories of the people who, to quote him, had the determination toward liberty, even at the cost of life. It would be hard, I think, if not impossible, for many of us to dream, to really imagine the kind of faith it would take to run away from the only home may have ever known, even though it be an unhappy home. Not just that, but into the dark of night and into the unknown and in many ways unknowable. To know that you would need to hide from slave catchers, to know that you would need to find food along the way, to know that there was really no established path, no paved or marked roads for you to follow. I believe it's impossible for us to today, at least most of us listening to this sermon, to imagine what making a choice like that, a choice to leave, must have been like. It took courage and, I'm sure, desperation, and I've no doubt it took faith. Faith that there could be help along the way. Faith that you would find people willing to feed you, to help you, to shelter you, or at the very least to turn a blind eye to you as you made your way to freedom. All through places you've never been. I'd like to invite you to imagine for a moment contemplating escaping on such an unknown journey of some 780 miles. That is the distance between Montgomery, Alabama and Cleveland, Ohio. Imagine facing such a dangerous journey. It's a journey few of us would contemplate even in the best of times. And yet, even today, there are refugees worldwide who are forced into this kind of decision. And yet the journey is and was undertaken. More often than not, it is not completed successfully. Heartbreakingly often, this is the story. But sometimes the journey was completed, and with great joy. Families reunited, new families created, and generations to follow. All of these journeys, those that reach the goal of freedom and those who are not able to, were assisted by the faith of people. The individual who was bold enough to begin had to have faith. The people of the Underground Railroad, the conductors, the station masters, those providing safe houses and depots, each of them working by what they understood to be the moral path. Each of these moral paths taught to them by their faiths, their differing faiths, different ways of expressing in their faith. When we consider our actions today, when we think about the meetings that we go to, or the protests, or the rallies, when we hold vigils, or deep and sometimes uncomfortable conversations in the service, we hope, of creating a world more just and more fair for all, a world of possibilities for the children that we love, biological or not, we are tapping into the same well of faith, even if it be called by different names. This is how humanity slowly, unsteadily, but surely advances, ever relying upon each other, ever inspiring one another. May our mutual admiration, affection, and effort truly transform our world. My final question to you today is this: what risks does your faith call you to take?